Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Harry Sherrod, and on behalf of the Talks team, very warm welcome to our talk this evening. So this evening's speaker, I think the phrase needs no introduction was kind of invented for this guy. One of the world's, if not the world's, most authoritative journalists and authors in the field of historic motorsport and also up-to-date motorsport. He's been quick to remind me as well, still following F1 up to this day. So big warm welcome, please, for Doug Nye.
Hello, everybody.
So it's a sort of flexible approach this evening. It's going to be largely Doug making his own way through his fascinating collection of slides, and I may intervene from time to time, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end. So over to you, Doug.
Thanks very much. Hello, everybody. My goodness, what a bunch of optimists you are. I actually regret having said yes to Harry when he asked me to do this. I just hope that a bit later on this evening you don't all agree with me. I've been asked to sort of talk about me, which is a bit unusual, really. I come from a normal family, I suppose. There was myself and my big brother, who's 8 years older, and our father was a gardener, and he worked for the same family for 40 years. And I guess in that case, he was the original wrinkled old retainer. But we never had a car. Dad didn't want to learn to drive because he thought if he learned to drive, he'd become a chauffeur. And then he'd always be on call for the family that he worked for. And so he happily never had a car. And it wasn't until my big brother actually bought one that, I sort of had my first experience of motoring. And essentially, cars were very exotic things to me. And when, that other people had and we didn't. And I didn't begrudge them that at all, but they were an object of fascination. And my brother then introduced me to Autosport magazine. And on the front cover was a picture of an Alfa Romeo 158. And I thought, wow, that looks interesting. And then I was about 6 years old when I first discovered this remarkable thing. And that absolutely fascinated me. And I learned that Brooklands was just up the road. And a few years later, when I could ride a bike, I rode up here. And at the time, I was interested in three things: warships, aeroplanes, and racing cars. And as I approached Brooklands here, there was this sibilant sort of whistling noise, and a Vickers Viscount appeared over the banking and flew over me. And in effect, I sort of fell off my bike. And soon after that, we constructed a raft and tried to sail in on the River Wey through the gap where the Hennebeek Bridge was. And the Hennebeek Bridge, the gap, features later because I never dreamed that many years later I would become involved in the campaign to purchase this car. John Cobb's Napier Railton, of course, 143 plus miles per hour, outer circuit, perpetual lap record breaker for display here at Brooklands. Anyway, I did get involved and I ended up driving this old lady here around the banking for photography. And the banking was so bumpy, I was going around the top of it, around the members' banking, just out here. And as I approached the gap, with the tops of the trees coming up through the gap, I hit the brake in the middle of the thing, of the pedal array, and I got my foot caught under the brake pedal and on top of the throttle. And I could see it before me, this great headline, fat twit crashes, invaluable, national treasure. And I somehow managed to do a 180-degree spin in it and get back down to the bottom of the banking, and I brought it back in one piece. And though I say it myself, I'm quite proud of that. But when I was a young lad, as it were, I was 12 years old, I guess, when this happened, when Stirling Moss and Tony Brooks won the British Grand Prix at Aintree in '57 in the Van Wall. And that was the first World Championship round win by an all-British Grand Prix car. And it was really the start of years of what became British domination of our preferred sport, or my preferred sport. And that sort of blew my mind, really, that should happen. And when I heard that at the end of 1958, Mr. Van der Velde was retiring his team, and Van Wall would be no more, I took my little team of 3 dinky toy Van Walls down our garden. I poured petrol on them and I set fire to them and cremated them. And that's another thing that I've always regretted. But anyway, I was studying at school in Guildford, and my English mistress, splendid name, my English mistress said, Doug, if you get good, or Douglas, if you get good exam results, I'm confident we can get you a place at university. And I knew that there was no way in this world that Mum and Dad could possibly afford for me to go to university. And in any case, she'd also said to me, you get a good degree, you can always get a job teaching the same subject to children. And I thought, well, so I get a job teaching a useless subject to other kids so that they can get a job teaching a useless subject to other kids, etc., etc., etc. And I thought, I really want to go motor racing. So the only thing I could do, I thought, was scribble a bit, because I'd done quite well in some various essay competitions. So I wrote to Autosport, first of all, saying, I sit on the loo every week and memorise your magazine from cover to cover, which was literally true. And you need somebody like me who's got my vast knowledge of what's happening. It was that bad, to work for you. And Gregor Grant, the editor of Autosport, bless him, wrote back and very wisely said, no, we haven't got a place vacant at the moment. But what he said was that I think Motor Racing magazine, the BRSCC's organ, they've got a vacancy for somebody at the moment. So I went and bought a copy of Motor Racing magazine and wrote to them. And it was October, I think, '63. And to my astonishment, I got a response from Alan Brinton, the editor, saying, I'm covering the RAC rally finish down in Bournemouth. On my way back, I'm coming through Guildford. I'd like to drop in and talk to you. And so this guy appeared, who subsequently I discovered I didn't really take a shine to. But he invited me for a proper interview at Brands Hatch, where their office was, with his partner, business partner, John Blunsden, and see if they would give me a job on Motor Racing magazine. And as it happened, they did. Mad, impetuous fools. And I started as the office boy. But I doubled up as number 2 of 2 on their companion magazine, which was Airfix magazine, because my hobby was building plastic models, some of which I've still got. And so I was given a job at Brands Hatch, and starting in December 63, so at the start of November, I was supposedly studying for university entrance, and at the beginning of December, I was the office boy at Brands Hatch, and I quite extraordinary, and I was in heaven, I must say. And the first job they gave me was to wash a Lotus Cortina road test car. So, never having washed a car before, because we'd never had one, I started at the bottom and worked up. You can imagine the state the poor thing was in. But anyway, meantime, they published the first thing that I ever had published, not under my name, but at least under my initials. And this was it. And I could draw a bit. And that was it. And there, it says DCN, which was me. And that was extraordinary. I was incredibly proud of that. And to some extent, so were my mum and dad, although they thought I was going to be writing oodles of stuff. And what I'd done was this silly drawing of Jack Sears falling out of his Lister Bristol. And Jack remembered that drawing and was very kind about it in subsequent years. But the person that I did warm to at Brands Hatch was my friend Darryl Reach, who was the editor of Airfix magazine, who taught me all about magazine production. And he was only 2 or 3 years older than me. And I owe him a hell of a lot. And I also owe a hell of a lot to the man on the right here, John Blunsden. And John Blunsden was the associate editor of Motor Racing magazine, and he was all-round good bloke. Politically, he was somewhere to the right of Genghis Khan. Honestly, he would have made Trump look like a babe in arms. But that's the way it was. And of course, John really liked dictators, and he's shaking hands with one right there. The blessed Enzo Ferrari, who I interviewed once, and just for once, I was completely tongue-tied, because if ever you were in the presence of history, it was meeting old man Ferrari. And at one point in our interview, which was filmed for BBC TV and then lost, I got him to laugh, and these 2 little gold teeth glinted blindingly in the office light. But he was very accommodating and very kind until I went wrong.
You had an interpreter, presumably, though, because he didn't speak?
No. It was interpreted by his assistant, Dr. Franco Gozzi. And Gozzi proved to be a great ally. And I thought I was doing well with the old man because I got him to laugh. And I asked Gozzi, I said, would you ask Mr. Ferrari how it was that he could be such a star team number 1 principal for the fascist regime pre-war, and then still be around to run his own team for the Republic post-war. And the colour drained out of Franco's face. And he said, I can't ask him that. I said, no, do, because it's always fascinated me. And so I don't think quickly enough to speak Italian, but I understand enough to know that what Gozzi asked the old man wasn't what I'd asked Gozzi. And what he said was, Mr. Nye seems to think that your team was nationalised. And the old man slammed his hand down on the table and said, basta, it's over, I go now. And then he said, give them a book, pointing at the entire crew. And then he said, uno solo, one only. So I ended up with a book from the old man, but, you know, he was very kind. But anyway, John Blunsdon, there he is on the left. John went on after Motor Racing magazine to run motor racing publications, and he became a great, mentor to me, really, in one respect, and that is in doing books. Because he asked me to do a book on Lotus, and it was the first proper book I'd ever done. And here's John with his own book on the Cosworth DFE engine with Graham Hill. And on the right, Walter Hayes of Ford, who sponsored, they put 100 grand into the Cosworth engine to have their name on the cam covers, effectively. But when I was working for John Blunsdon at Brands Hatch, testing would go on, and this picture is of Jimmy Clark, as you can see here. Jimmy and camera crew, and he's in the lay-by on the outside of Paddock Bend, for anybody who knows Brands Hatch, as it was. And then here, wearing a black knitted woolly pulley made by his mum, is me. And in those days, I was quite sylph-like, and I was absolutely enthralled. And that sort of access really made me think, I want to do this for as long as I can. And amazingly, I still am. Thanks to a very tolerant readership. But anyway, another person that I owe an enormous debt to is this chap. Some of you will remember him as Cyril Posthumus, the editor of the Brooklyn Society magazine for many years. And Cyril was just a wonderful man. I mean, he really was. He was friendly and accommodating and very open to somebody very much younger. And he told me all sorts of things about great racing drivers of the past and the present, but particularly of the past. And the fact that he'd been here to Brooklands in the 30s and so on, you know, and then he'd become a model maker, subsequently became one of the founding editors of Motoring News, and then my editor on Motor Racing magazine. And dear old Cyril was wonderful until Motor Racing was sold to another publishing house, and they decided they wanted to bring back John Blunsdon and Alan Brinton. And I so adored poor old Cyril that when they told me that he was leaving, but they wanted me to take on, I'm afraid, being a very direct sort of person, I said to them that you can fold your job until the edges are sharp and you can stick it, etc., 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 and walked out. And then I worked for 6 months thinking there would be no politics in a family company for motorsport. And I was number 2 to Bill Boddy at Motorsport. And Cyril had already introduced me to Dennis Jenkinson, of which more shortly. But this bloke on the left was probably the biggest influence on me, and that's Geoffrey Goddard, the great photographer. And here he is at one Belgian Grand Prix with the just retired Jimmy Clark, standing up at the top of the hill at Eau Rouge. And Jeff was the most wonderful bloke. He had this incredibly crusty exterior, and he became known to the press in this country as irascible of Camberley. And he was irascible. He was incredibly irascible on one level. On another level, he could be incredibly engaging. He could be hilariously funny. He was a great photographer, a great book collector, and he loved the history of motor racing and the photographic record of it. And here he is at the Nürburgring, and on the left there that's Laurie Morton, who was a great photographer for Motoring News and Motorsport through the 60s and 70s. That is another wonderful bloke, Maurice Rowe of Motor, Uncle Maurice, who was literally that, very avuncular, pipe smoking, friendly to everybody. And they both got on like a house on fire with Irascible of Camberley here. And that's Jeff at his best, actually, and his most engaging. If you were a German policeman or one of the police at Monza, he wasn't half as engaging. And he was arrested at Monza, and they were on the verge of throwing him in the chokey there for pushing a policeman that was in his way. And Bernard Caillet, the great French photojournalist, actually sprung him from the Italian police, which was something of an achievement. But Caillet himself had been a resistance fighter during the Second World War in France, and I think the Italian police realised when they'd met their match. Here's Jeff in a more relaxed pose. That's quite typical. After lugging his cameras, and usually a very heavy camera case for miles around somewhere like Nürburgring. And we were at the Nürburgring together one weekend. And I said to him, during practice, and I patted my pockets and I said, Jeff, have you got a pen? And he slammed down his case and he slammed down his cameras and said, have I got a pen? He said, bleeding journalist, he said, you can't even carry a pen. And he was quite right, absolutely quite right. But he loved photography of circuits that were geographical. So you saw somebody racing, driving against the limits of geography. And his photographs record all that, because they're scenic as well. And by 1977, he was finding himself excluded from the areas he wanted to go to by, you've guessed it, the local police. And he didn't get on with policemen, so he decided that the prudent thing to do was to jack it in. So he jacked it in, and subsequently, my friend Paul Vesti, who's here, and, bought Jeff's archive of photography, and we've looked after it and maintained it and worked with it ever since. And we've had it for 20-odd years now. And every time we look through Jeff's negatives, you find something that you had no idea would be there. Some magical stuff.
Are you going to publish it as a book, or the photographs?
Give us a break.
Sounds fascinating.
No, Jeff didn't like it when some of the great motor racing stages were threatened. And when Jackie Stewart led the campaign against Spa, and was right to do so in retrospect, Jeff decided that he was a Mickey Mouse driver, and a Mickey Mouse driver deserved a Mickey Mouse camera. And that's absolutely typical Jeff. It was humorous. It was deadly serious. He really meant it. but he made the point. And he made the point so much that for a period, his negatives don't have pictures of Jackie Stewart in a Tyrrell in them, because if he saw Stewart coming, he would put his camera behind his back and stand there and not point a camera at him as he went past, just to make the point. He was that cussed. And somebody else who could be cussed, but who wasn't with many people, was this little chap here. On the right, Dennis Jenkinson. And Jenks was just remarkable. You know, I mean, he redefined enthusiasm. He got into motor racing in 1938-39 right here, looking after an Alta that was being run by Robert Cowell. And Robert Cowell, of course, is Bob Cowell, Spitfire pilot, who decided he'd rather be Roberta, and he became Roberta Cowell with the much publicised first major British sex change operation immediately post-war. And Jenks maintained to his dying day that Cowell merely did it for the publicity. But Jenks was an extraordinary bloke. He stood sort of barely 5'3", didn't weigh very much. But as a teenager, he'd been a very talented swimmer, competition swimmer and diver, and a gymnast. And it was nothing to him to cycle 60, 80 miles a day. Quite extraordinary little man. And his gymnastic background stood him in good stead post-war. And there he is, this one, the passenger, with Eric Oliver. And in 1949, 75 years ago right now, they ended up at this event, which is the presentation of the very first Motorcycle World Championship sidecar title award. And there's Eric and little Jenks there then. And Jenks went on to passenger for a Belgian, Marcel Mazouy. That's Marcel Mazouy there, subsequently killed in an accident suffered with a different passenger when the passenger bailed out on him and left him to his own devices. And Jenks always said that, bailing out from a sidecar, if the combination's in trouble, it just showed rank bad form. But Jenks became, as you're all aware, I'm sure, continental correspondent of Motorsport magazine. And there he is, industrious as ever, with his beloved Porsche 356. And that car, whose registration was UY34, is still around, and it raced at the Goodwood Revival this year, driven by another friend of mine, Robert Barry. But this really is, I guess, in the car world, Jenks's most famous exploit, when he navigated Stirling Moss in the 55 Millimilia in their works Mercedes 300 SLR. And here's the team with young Hans Hermann over there, who's still with us, well into his 90s. Another wonderful bloke. The great Fangio, of course, 5 times world champion. Stirling. Carl Kling, the German driver, who was upstaged at Mercedes, not only by this gentleman, but also by this one. And here's little Jenks, with Fangio appreciating his beard on the basis that only sailors wore beards in those days, or very, very disreputable used car dealers. And this wonderful picture is of Jenks holding out his route card to be stamped at the the final control in Florence before they set the record time from Florence back to Brescia, and they completed the whole 1,000 miles in 10 hours and 7 minutes. You imagine that? If Stirling had been a truck driver, he'd be arrested for that today, wouldn't he, for the time? And that's including this spin on the descent of the Futa Pass. Well, that was extraordinary. And when that happened, Jenks reached down to clear a lockout on the gear shift, which prevented the driver from inadvertently selecting reverse instead of first. And as he reached down to clear the lockout, Stirl already had his right hand on the gear shift and was heaving it round to go into first, and was knocking the lockout away with his thumb. And it ended up with him in first gear and Jenks with his finger trapped in the gear change mechanism on top of the gearbox. And when subsequently they came to run in the Festival of Speed in 722, their Mille winning car, Jenks said, "Now let me get this straight, in 1.25 miles, I've got to lose my glasses blown away over the side, replace them with another pair, get my finger caught in the gear shift. I've got to throw up over the side, and I've got to tell you how every corner goes. Is that right?" Well, we thought that was taking, commemoration a bit far, but we took his point. Now, where Mercedes are concerned, of course, in recent years we've seen, God, I've forgotten his name, Lewis Hamilton. What a name to forget. We've seen Lewis Hamilton complaining of bouncing. Well, amongst our photographs, we can show Lewis that he ain't seen nothing yet. Not too bad, was it? And that was actually on the Rabolövsbana circuit at Kristianstad in Sweden, where they raced. And this is Jenks's diary. And as you can see down here, you see Sunday, May the 1st, 1955. And he says, up at 6 a.m. for race day, we won. Party in evening with Mercedes-Benz, bed at 7 a.m.
It was a long day.
Long day, heavy day. In later years, he was reunited with a 300 SLR. In this case, the coupe, the rare coupe. And this one, as you can see, it's got red upholstery. You see, oh, wrong one. Hang on, how do I go back? Yep. Cracked it. Crikey, I've impressed myself. Red upholstery. The sister car to that engineer Uhlenhout famously used as his private transport for years, had blue upholstery, and it was known as Blue. And this one was known as, guess what? And I ended up eventually being given a drive in that, in the Mille Miglia Retro, which was like, well, can't tell you what it was like, but it was such an honour. It was unbelievable. And anyway, the star of all these exploits, as Jenks was always quick to point out, wasn't him at all. It was Stirling. And here's Stirl reading Jenks's diary long after Jenks had passed away, and just roaring with laughter at every page of it, because it was very entertaining. And Jenks here with Henry Manny. Anybody here remember Henry Manny? Yeah? He was the great writer for Road and Track magazine, the American magazine, and he wrote in a style that was accurate, but it was entertaining. And I greatly admired Henry because he got you interested, and got you entertained as well, which I think is terribly important if you're going to learn anything, you know, because I've got traumatic memories of boring lessons at school. Didn't remember a damn thing. But we had a wonderful history master called Jim Pollard, who had a gin bottle in his desk and was found crying one day beside a broken gin bottle. But you know, it's a question of if you're entertained, it's more likely to lodge in your brain. And Jenks gave me the best advice I've ever heard as a journalist, and that was, he said, you know, just remember, he said that written English doesn't have to be a different language from spoken English. Just write as if you're meeting your mates in the pub and you're telling them what you've just seen. And that sort of stuck with me. And I suppose to some extent, although it was instinctive, that's what I've tried to do since. And here's the young me, that one there. Henry in the background listening in with his ever-present cigar, and Jim Hall of Chaparral, who became one of my big heroes. And that's at the Nürburgring 1000 Kims one year. And when I became involved with Goodwood and we organised the first Festival of Speed in '93, I drew up a list of 10 people and cars that I really wanted to get to the festival. And it took us 10 years, but eventually we got Jim there. And there he is. And he could not believe, he just could not believe the reaction of the Goodwood crowd. It was quite extraordinary, and that's why we've had Chaparral there several times since, because he got such a friendly reception. And he said to me at one point, Doug, he said, there are guys here who know more about what I've done than I do. and you know, that is so true, because the British enthusiast public is so knowledgeable in such depth, a lot of people are staggered. When I walked into the paddock once with Froilán González from Argentina, you know, the winner of the first World Championship Grand Prix that Ferrari ever scored here in the British Grand Prix in '51. I was with him and his son Julio, and we walked into the paddock and there was a spontaneous mass applause from the people there. And Julio said to me, how do they know who he is? He said, he doesn't get this reaction in Argentina. And, you know, it was true. But people I've respected over the years include these two, Ron Tornack of Brabham on the left and Colin Chapman on the right, looking normally so elegant. And Colin was incredibly vain. He was always combing his hair, anathema to me. And but there he is, you know, wearing this wonderful T-shirt somewhere. This is more like the Colin Chapman that I knew and respected so much and liked so much, actually. Again, he was somebody that you would never buy a used car from, or even an unused car, because you knew that you would have to mend it almost every day. And when he famously received complaints from his American distributor that their new Lotus cars leaked, you know, leaked when it rained, he said, have you ever tried gumboots? Which was not exactly user-friendly, but still. But Jeff took that picture one day when we were at Ketteringham Hall, and I laid out a load of Jeff's photographs for Colin when I was doing a book called Theme Lotus. And Colin looked at them, and then he picked up the phone and he said to his secretary, hold all my calls. He said, I'll be a long time on this one. And I thought, you know, cool, we've really arrived here. And then a bit later, she stuck her head round the door and said, Mr. Chapman, I'm sorry to interrupt. I know you said hold your course, but Mr. Ecclestone is on the phone. And Colin looked at us and winked and said, oh, it's me boss, he said. I must answer this one. So he went off and talked for a while and then came back to us. But going through all the pictures, and when he came to a picture of Jimmy Clark, he went very quiet, and then he tapped his finger on the photograph, and he said, that is the finest man I ever met. And this is a different character. This is the wonderful Tom Wheatcroft. And in 1970, mutual friend Ian Young, who got to know Tom on the Tasman races in New Zealand and Australia, got me and Jenks, and that's Jenks in the grey, with his back to the camera, involved with helping Wheaty set up his Donington collection of single-seater racing cars. And Tom was an extraordinary man, and he spoke an impenetrable sort of Leicester builders dialect that nobody in the world could understand. And I became his translator, in effect, because he tended to leave out verbs and lots of nouns from his sentences, and he knew what he was talking about, but nobody else would. And I used to sit there when he was meeting somebody from television or somebody from I don't know, all sorts of people, you know, from sponsors and so on. And he'd say, isn't that right, Doug? And I'd say, yes, what Mr. Wheatcroft has just said is... And he'd slap me on the back, roar with laughter, just like that, and say, you have got it, you have got it. And so I was quite useful. And he let us play with his cars as we were here with the Vanwall. And that is an earlier... That was one of the first cars that he brought back from Australia, which was the ex-Peter Whitehead Ferrari 125. It should have had a 1.5 litre supercharged V12 Ferrari engine in it. Tom bought it back and he was a bit shaken when he realised it had a 5 litre Corvette V8 in it. But he should have paid more attention. And anyway, there it was. And when I drove it, that's Tom having just blown up a Bugatti in the background. And me learning about the Ferrari 125 and discovering that in supercharged 1.5 litre form, it had not quite the same handling, but it had all the power and torque of a Triumph TR4. And that was about it, you know. But there were real compensations operating for Donington, as when he sent me down to Maranello to take delivery of a Ferrari, 1970 Ferrari Formula One car. And there's the young me in the Donington Transporter, which I drove illegally part of the way, with the Ferrari lads loading it up. And it was at that point that I first met the old man, when we were sitting... This is the back of the old Ferrari Assistenza in central Modena. And we were sitting in an office there, and it still panelled with little sort of fan-light wired glass windows. And there was one in the doorway. And suddenly these eyes appeared in the doorway, obviously a very tall man, just peering in. And the door opened, and in walked Mr. Ferrari. And what I didn't realise was that I was sitting there doing the money transfer with a chap called Piero Lardi. And Piero, of course, was the old man's natural son, but we didn't know it at the time. And when he'd introduced himself to me, I thought, slopey eyes and a big hooter. He reminds me of somebody, and I couldn't think who. And then in walked the prototype. And Lardi spoke to him in Italian, didn't call him Papa, and said something about, Mr. Wheatcroft. And the old man extended his hand And I shook it, and Piero was still talking. And then he realised that I was not the young English millionaire that he pictured. I was just some lackey who'd been sent out to collect the car. So he sort of looked me up and down, turned around and walked out again. But playing at Donington could have its downside, as when I thought I'd become complete master of the V16 BRM. And the tyre marks are mine. Unfortunately, I managed to keep it off the wall. But that was during a week we spent there with Phil Hill, who was doing a series of Donington car road tests for Road and Track magazine, for which I wrote at the time as a freelance. So, you know, I'm no great racing driver, and dear old Tom rubbed it in, as you can see. That's me in a V12 Auto Union from 1939, Colin Crabb's car, that unfortunately had a Hewland gearbox, but never mind, you know, it ran. But, you know, here's one of the truly greats, and this is a wonderful, I think, Jeff Goddard portrait of Fangio, no less. And I subsequently got to do a book with him, and I was hugely impressed by him, obviously, just hugely impressed, because he was so humble and so friendly and so accommodating. And he spent endless time talking, again through an interpreter. But you got the feeling that if you were sitting beside him on an airliner and the airliner made a forced landing and was on fire, who would be the first person that he would tread on to get out? And it would be you. It really would, because he had this extraordinary sort of radiating core of steel to him, dressed up in this wonderfully gentlemanly and gentle, truly gentle exterior. But you could see what made him the great warrior that he truly was. Now, with Phil Hill, who I mentioned earlier, we went to Nürburgring in '78 for a week's testing of the Daimler-Benz museum cars. And here's Phil in, well, that's actually a post-war built W154 or 163 Grand Prix car, pre-war design. But it's one that they completed post-war to race in Argentina. But Phil drove it around the South Circuit of the Nürburgring. And being there on the South Circuit and larking about with these cars was just an incredible experience. And that's really when I became, well, really a pretty close friend, I think, of Phil. He was the most wonderful bloke. He could talk to you about anything. He had a great sense of the ridiculous. But he was just so knowledgeable and so willing to share his knowledge. And that's exemplified really by this picture. This is when he was delivering about a 20-minute masterclass on the ventilated disc brakes on the rear of the Mercedes Grand Prix car. And during this period, I was contributing to a Japanese magazine, and the bloke who was the editor there, effectively, introduced me to a Japanese collector, and the Japanese collector asked me to buy some cars for him. So the front forecourt at our house in Farnham ended up looking like this, which is the wonderful snowplough Ferrari prototype that was never raced. They didn't inflict its ugliness upon the paying public. But in the background is an ex-Carlos Reutemann T2. And I just bought these two cars for the Japanese collector. And they lived on my forecourt for a fortnight because I didn't have a garage to put them in. So at night, I tucked them up under a tarpaulin, I'm ashamed to report. But that was an experience of cars hands-on. And then I was able to buy this wonderful Lotus 49, which is R3, which is the National Motor Museum car today. And I actually stripped that in our little garage, which is to the right of the picture here, and it was corrugated iron. It was all rusty because we couldn't afford to mend it. And the rust was so bad, there were loads of holes in the corry iron. And when you switched the light on in it, on a November evening, it was like not the solarium, what's it called? The planetarium, thank you. It was like the planetarium with these radiating beams of light coming out through the holes. With this ex-Graham Hill Formula One car sitting there inside in a million bits. But Michael Caine, great restorer, restored that for me. And I'll never forget his face when I showed him the garage and showed him what was inside it. Because our little garage also had a dirt floor, and I hadn't told him that bit. Meantime, at Donington, here's Jenks in this wonderful 1939 Grand Prix car, which Tom had borrowed from the Prague National Technical Museum in Czechoslovakia. And they didn't get it back for 2 years, and it ended up with something of a major international incident before he let it go. Where international incidents are concerned, here's me in command of a tank. It was one of the things that I road tested for Road and Track magazine. But the road test that I really enjoyed was on this wonderful car, which is the Alfa T33 Stradale. Mm-hmm. And I think this is one of the most beautiful automotive products of all time, styled by a chap called Franco Scaglione. Jeff wanted to photograph it, and so we towed it out of my house, my little forecourt there, a little way down the road, and Jeff looked at the location I'd chosen and said, no, this won't do, we want somewhere better. So we towed it on a bit further. No, it's no good. A bit further. No, don't like it, don't like the background. I want a distant background. So we towed it a bit further, and we ended up here. And that's Odium Military Airfield in the background. And we ended up towing this car, this wonderful car, for about 25 miles. So I ended up doing a towed road test, which I think remains unique, describing what it was like to be in the Alfa Romeo Stradale on the end of a very short tow rope, which was a bit of fun. And through that, I met this bloke who was another just immensely formative influence. And this is Robert Brooks, the auctioneer. And I'd known Robert since he was a boy, wearing a brown coat as a porter at Christie's, South Kensington, which was managed by his father. And his father, Bill, was a fearsome auctioneer. Be quiet at the back, I'm running this show, that sort of thing, you know. Robert learned at Bill's knee and became a very, very good and infinitely more friendly auctioneer. But he asked me to help him write the catalogue for the BRM sale for Christie's in 1981. And in 88, he asked me subsequently to become a consultant to the company. And I ended up doing things like this. And this was the day that we went to somewhere in Berkshire to collect the ex-Dennis Poor Alfa Romeo HC 1935 Grand Prix car for sale by auction. And that car was just unutterably genuine and original. It was incredible. And in the transporter that was equally original, we found the tab for the last time the transporter had been fuelled. And there was the bill from a garage at Midhurst on the way back from Goodwood in 1955. And that was the last time that had been run. And that was a wonderful car, and it was subsequently screwed up by a subsequent owner who uprated it, quotes, for historic racing. But with Brooks, and Bonhams as it is now. We went round the world several times. And here's Malcolm Barber of Brooks with the driver who was a teammate of Fangio's here, Clemar Bucci. And this is Clemar Bucci's ex-Achille Varzi Alfa Romeo with a special V12 engine installed for racing in Argentina. As it happened, we were so successful on that trip that it never went to auction with us, but never mind. Getting involved with the reconstruction and restoration of old cars, this was another thing, and this is me clutching the crankcase for a V12 Auto Union at Crossweight and Gardner's, that wonderful outfit. It really was extraordinary. And Robert and I sort of went around looking at old cars in all sorts and bits in all sorts of places. We went to Australia and Argentina and Uruguay and Brazil, Romania, year before the revolution. And then Robert wangled us an exceptional trip, but it was one that had some hazards attached. And this was a trip, would you believe, to the Falkland Islands. And we spent 2 weeks on the Falklands, ostensibly valuing the regimental silver of some of the defence forces out there. Well, you know, like this, with the wonderful RAF detachment at Mount Pleasant. But both Robert and I had deep interest in military history. And here's Robert on the top of Mount Tumbledown with Stanley in the background there. And that's Stanley Harbour through there. And over behind us, over this side, is Fitzroy and Bluff Cove. And you all know what happened there. And we also sold aircraft as well as cars. And this Spitfire, one of the first two-seaters to be auctioned, was one of the things that I had to catalogue, and I was delighted to do so. Filming it there is David Wegelin, who made so many films and who did the Motor Films Quarterly series with me. And poor Weg, I'm sure he'd send his regards to everybody at Brooklands, because he did an awful lot here. And unfortunately, he's been struck down with Parkinson's, and he's not very well at all. But do spare a thought for him. But larking about in aircraft, you know, led to this photograph, which is a complete fraud, really, because it's me flying a Hercules simulator around the Mac Loop in Wales. But meanwhile, more important things, Goodwood. And this is 1948, September. Stirling Moss in his favourite number 7 in his first serious circuit race, which he won at Goodwood. And by the time I went to Goodwood, 64 to 66, but by the late 80s, it was in this sort of condition. The pits have gone. But one of the things that we did in around 91, I think, was run some Ferraris in a sprint there with this wonderful ex-Count de Portago 250 GT Tour de France. And I'm being chased through the chicane there by somebody who became another great influence upon me, Paul Vesti. It's all your fault, Paul. In his Moss 1960 Goodwood TT winning, 250 GT short wheelbase with another photo collecting friend, Matt Spitzley. And that was a bit of fun. Incidentally, where the Moss GT short wheelbases are concerned, the radio aerial tells you this one is the 1960 car, as do the bumperettes, whereas the 61 car doesn't have those. That's the car in which Stirling allegedly listened to the radio commentary when he was leading the race. Well, he had better hearing than I've got because they're so darn noisy inside. But we subsequently, through Robert Brooks, got invited to the inaugural Classic Adelaide rally. And I picked up the phone to Paul and said, "Are you doing anything this November? Would you like to come to Australia and bring a car?" And this is the sort of result that we had. We thought I thought that was rather splendid sign. God supplies our need and not our wants. And there's PV with his short wheelbase in darkest South Australia. And there we spent a lot of time with these two people. And that's dear old Sir Jack Brabham and Vern Schuppen. And you couldn't meet two nicer Australians than those two. You really couldn't. And I subsequently did a book with Jack that he asked me to do. And one of the things about the Classic Adelaide was that it was organised by an extraordinary bloke called Dave the Duck Edwards. And Dave was just the world's biggest extrovert. And he loved to be seen to be doing things. And he'd grown up as an Aussie rules football player. And he was very small for a Aussie rules football player, but he was very quick. But because he was small, he was quite short, his backside was close to the ground. And when he ran, apparently it waggled from side to side. So they christened him the Duck. He was the Duck Edwards. Well, dear old Duck took us on we did 13 consecutive Classic Adelaides. The Duck took us to an Argentine steak restaurant in Adelaide. And he announced to all and sundry, "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "Sir Jack Brabham is going to tackle the 1 kilogram steak." Well, that's 2.2 pounds, you know. And here's Jack proudly showing it off to everybody before he started. And, about 10, 15 minutes later, the Duck stood up and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to report that Sir Jack has finished the 1 kilogram steak." There was a huge round of applause. And then somebody said, "How was it, Jack?" And Jack stood up and very, very slowly said, "It was very nice. What there was of it." Typical Jack. And here's myself as intrepid navigator in Paul's Ferrari, California, that we took there, well, at least twice, maybe 3 times. And I never got lost, or at least that's my story. Paul will tell you differently, but it's all lies. That's the view with those wonderful 6 trumpets and 12 cylinders hurling us between the trees in South Australia. And then I think the second year we went, Paul very rashly took his GTO and very much more rashly let me drive it. And here we are on a stage called the Gorge Road. But on a previous stage, the first one I'd driven, it started off with a wonderful curving right-hander that went on for about 1,000 yards it must have been. And then it came round to a sharp left-hander around a blind brow. And as we came round there, with the thing absolutely singing its heart out, I hit the brakes for the right-hander, well over on the right-hand side of the road. And the right-hand front brake grabbed and the car turned sharp right. And through masterly recovery by me, because by this time I was very good at masterly recoveries, we survived and we did get round to the left. But poor old Paul lost it, which was the first and only time I think that I've ever been the butt of his anger. And he said, for heaven's sake, just calm down. And I said, I'm calm, it's your bloody car. And anyway, we went on from there. Subsequently, we experienced 2 brake failures on the Classic Adelaide with the same car. Hence the cap that you can see me wearing here. And this is Matt Spitzley's Alpha 8C 2300 that they loaned us for a day on a run through Victoria into New South Wales afterwards. But, you know, we never came back from Australia without our ribs aching, because for 2 weeks we'd done nothing but laugh because such funny things happened. And this picture, this commemorates a remarkable bloke, actually, because here we are in Australia with me looking, of course, racing fit, as you can see. That is Don Law, the race car preparer, and that is Staffan Svenby, a Swedish bloke who owned a circuit in Sweden and was also Ronnie Peterson's manager. And Staffan was a lovely bloke. And other people who ran on the rally each year were the Mercedes Museum people and driving various Mercedes, as you can imagine. And Staffan loved taking the mickey out of them as the Yermans. And whenever we arrived for a lunch stop or a tea break somewhere, he would leap out of his seat type and then bawl at the top of his voice, "Where are all the Yermans?" And I think they got a bit tired of being described as the Yermans, but anyway, we had a lot of fun with it and a lot of fun with them because mainly they took it in good part. But when I got back, I drew this cartoon. I better read it to the people at the back. As you can see, come to sunny Stuttgart. It's got Warsaw crossed out, Paris crossed out, and Longbridge crossed out. These 2 chaps are both reminiscent of some of the Mercedes people. Swedes, Danes, the Britishers, silly asses, I have them all in my sights. Up here, let's have a look. Hold your fire, Dummkopf. They have stolen unser road book. And the Zeppelin, meanwhile, it says, visit Deutschland before we visit you. I found that just the other day, and I'd forgotten all about it. But thank you. All donations gratefully received. But the Germans weren't above sending themselves up. And this is the famous Mercedes team manager, Neubauer, Alfred Neubauer. And if you felt the team needed it, he would go out of his way to entertain them. And he was excellent at that. You know, if they were down or if they were stressed, he would do something like that. Stirling told me that in Stirling's first race with them in Buenos Aires, in the long, long flight on the way down, Neubauer decided that the young drivers needed a bit of, geeing up, a bit of entertainment. So he went to the loo in the back of the aeroplane. And then when he came out, because he's such a great big man with a huge corporation, he pretended to have got stuck in the doorway of the loo. And he was calling out to his young drivers, Moss, Hermann, here kommt. Come and save me. And that passed another half hour while they got him unstuck. But with the Mercedes Museum, I was subsequently really pleased that they invited me to take part in the Mille Miglia Retro in an SSK. And that's the SSK on the Mille Miglia Retro, which I concluded was the most dangerous event I'd ever been involved with. With people doing the stupidest things. in silly cars, and all imagining that they were in the Mille Miglia race, particularly some of the Americans who'd only ever driven round right-angled corners. And you know, there were some terrible accidents, including fatalities involving American entrants. But, you know, we had a great time with the SSK, and even, would you believe, through snow, and this is on the Mille Miglia Retro. But it was on that near Siena, they let me drive the XK, I'll get this right in a minute, the Mercedes SLR Coupe, red, that I was talking about earlier. And the noise in that car was just unbelievable. You know, I was offered earplugs and I turned them down. But I discovered why, because my ears were ringing for 3 or 4 days afterwards. And here in Siena, here we are just coming into the outskirts of the town, and you come through the little roads in Siena and then out into the big plaza in the centre. And the BMW works team were there with their Mille Miglia 328s. But everybody was looking around, wondering what this noise was, like a low-flying aeroplane. And the noise was us in the SLR. And when we drew to a stop at the control and flipped the doors open, they all looked in expecting to see some superstar. And they saw some bearded old fart that they didn't recognise. And the look of disappointment was incredible. There it is with the steering wheel removed, which was the only way you can get in and out. Me pondering theft. But in 2014, they asked me to participate in the 1914 2014 centenary of their 1, 2, 3, 4 win in the French Grand Prix. And Eddie Beresford drove this car, which belongs to the Collier collection. And Robert had introduced me to Miles Collier, who is singularly the most remarkable person I've ever met in any walk of life. If Lord March, now the Duke at Goodwood, is the hardest working person I've ever met, Miles Collier is the most philanthropic and most broadly talented man I've ever met. Enormously impressive figure. He inherited a large sum of money. He turned it into a much larger sum of money, endowed his museum and the Revs Institute library and everything that they do. And anyway, I ended up as crewman with another great friend, Eddie Beresford here, the one-man band restorer from Derbyshire, who had got the Mercedes to run as perfectly as it did. And if we'd been there in 1914, as you can see next, we would have struck fear into the hearts of the French. Another great friend, really, dear old Murray Walker, who we described as Muddley Talker. And dear old Muddley was great, absolutely great. And that's with another love of mine, which is Van Wall, of course. And on one of our trips to Australia, Robert and I went and persuaded John Dawson Damer here to bring a car from his Lotus collection to the Goodwood Festival of Speed. And unfortunately, that went terribly wrong. John crashed the car and was killed. And that still remains quite a difficult memory. But, you know, at least he'd had one good trip there. It was the second trip when the accident happened. But meantime, Goodwood was a huge part of my life. And is Robert batting and me wicket-keeping. Robert subsequently sliced the ball, which flew up and hit me about there, and gave me an enormous swelling, closed eye, black eye. And when Dan Gurney saw me the following day. He thought it was the funniest thing he'd ever seen, slapped me on the back and said, "Guy, you look like the only man who ever said no to Lord March." And I was standing in the food queue, typically, in the drivers' club, and a chap in the queue tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Hey, aren't you the bloke who got hit in the cricket the other day?" And I said, "Yes, I'm." He said, "Oh, where'd it get you then?" So I told him, right up. But this, the car that first attracted me to Brooklands, really, and became so educational to me, which I love, is the big friendly giant. And I got involved with the scheme that was masterminded by Robert Brooks, incidentally, to have it bought for the nation by the National Memorial Heritage Trust Fund. And it's been so well looked after here. It was restored by P&A Wood. And when it first came back here, I drove it for photography around the banking. And going quite quickly, really, around the banking with all the sunken slabs. It was bounding about like this. And then I came round to where the Hennebeek Bridge used to be, which is now a yawning gap, with the trees growing up. And I hit what I thought was the brake, and it was the throttle. And my foot was then trapped on the throttle underneath the brake. And all these headlines flashed through my mind, "Fat twit destroys national treasure." And I managed to really do a corner it in a style that would have been reminiscent of one of these drifters today, and got it back down to the bottom of the banking, 180-degree turns. Managed to extract my foot from under the accelerator, under the brake pedal, and continue. Another car I've driven with Brooklands in mind is Mephistopheles, which was still on its original airship engine, slobbering oil and fuel and water everywhere, steam. And we got that to Goodwood. And then this wonderful thing, which I dearly love, again, another Collier car, the Le Mans from 1950 Le Mans. I had a horror of doing a magazine track test and dressing as if I was a racing driver, which a lot of journalists do, and I couldn't abide doing that because it's as if you're making out you're a driver, and I ain't. But, if one engine wasn't enough, we tried two with the Bimotori Alpha. And then here's Eddie Beresford and yet another Collier car at Goodwood with his small lightweight passenger. And at Goodwood again, the man who was my hero when I was a little kid and who subsequently became a very valued friend, Stirling, in the Mercedes. And at one of the revival meetings in later years, here's Stirl, and this wonderful BBC, I don't think it was BBC, but anyway, this wonderful TV interview of Vicky sitting there. And at one point, the gentleman with the beard is the TV producer, and he was a star turn in his own right. But at one point, Vicky asked, Nikki, sorry, that was her name. Nikki asked Stirling a question, and he said, "God, that's a good question." And he turned to me and said, "God, Doug," he said, "smashing piece of crumpet, this one." And she took it in great part, while I was quailing. She thought that was hilarious, and she really, I think she still tells that story to this day. And subsequently, I got to do, I wrote, Susie, Stirling's wife, asked me to ride with him in the DB3S Aston that he drove on his last appearance at Goodwood. And I took this photograph of him at the time. And don't worry, we've nearly finished. And Stirling was so totally occupied with driving the car that when I said to him, "Come on, Stirl, give the crowd a wave," there was no reaction at all. And I realised that he just wasn't hearing what I was saying to him. And I realised then that something was seriously wrong. And sadly, so it proved to be. And those laps in the DB3S were the very last laps, as far as I know, that he ever did at Goodwood, the circuit on which he'd started all those years before. Jenks, meanwhile, Jenks's cottage has become famous, and I thought you'd just like to see these pictures of his cottage. This is at Rycommon Lodge, and this is when he was still around and operating from there. Let's see if I can press the right button.
You get it?
Yeah, oh, that's it. Yeah. There's the cottage. That's a shed, outbuilding, made out of old packing cases. There's another one made out of old packing cases. They were Honda motorcycle packing cases from his friend Ken, who was a Honda dealer. And he didn't like the motorbikes, but he loved the packing cases. There's Jenks's Porsche. That's his Mille Miglia BMW. And that is some old wreck. But in later years, this is what the cottage became. And here's what it was like after Jenks had passed away. And Jeff Goddard and I became his executors. And we had to clear up all of this. And there were bramble bushes everywhere with cars in them. And that, would you believe, is the Formula One Emerson Grand Prix car, sitting in the open. And he bought that because he wanted the Duesenberg engine for the Duesenberg that is now the property of this museum, because he left it to the Brooklands Museum, and Jeff and I were very proud to hand it over. And the people I owe most to are Jeff Goddard on the left there. That's with Pete Stevens, the car stylist who did the McLaren F1, amongst other things. And Pete is Dennis Jenkinson's nephew. And there's Jenks there. And one last thing I've got to do before this farrago of nonsense finishes is just show you this, because this is really the story of my life, with people screaming at me down the telephone. And me saying, deadline, deadline. Nobody said anything to me about a blank deadline. Anyway, there you go. Happy Christmas, everybody.
Thank you very much. Well, it is nearly 9 o'clock, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sure a couple of you are bursting to ask Doug a question. So we have the roving mic. This is the other roving mic, presumably you've only got one now. So anybody like to ask Doug a question?
Earlier you talked about dinky toys. Do you still have any? And if you do, which is your favourite?
Would I?
Dinky toys?
Yes. And would I what?
Do you have any still, and which is your favourite?
Well, I do have some dinky toys, but they're not particularly my favourites. I'm more into sort of Exoto and stuff like that these days, I'm afraid. Sorry.
Thank you.
Doug, what do you make of the current Formula One regulations and cars? How do they appeal to you?
I'm still interested in current Formula One, and I'm a kind of consultant to the Mercedes-AMG Formula One team on heritage, and their record keeping is extraordinary, and it's an absolute example for every other team. The cars as they stand are great gormless devices. Do you realise that well, not the current Mercedes, but 2 years ago, the Mercedes Formula One car had a wheelbase that was 2 inches longer than a Speed 6 Bentley. And if you consider that, that's ridiculous to carry, you know, one young man round and round in circles, chasing a bunch of other young men who are all overpaid and under-risked. But apart from that, I love it. I'll stop while I'm ahead.
Doug, how would you say that the old man and Chunky Chapman compared and contrasted in their personality and the running team?
Sorry, say that again?
Chunky Chapman and the old man, Enzo and Colin. How do they compare and contrast?
Oh, that's a very interesting question, actually, because old man Ferrari was dazzled by motor racing, and he saw his road cars as a way to go racing. Colin Chapman was really dazzled by performance cars, and he loved racing, and he loved winning, but he saw his road cars as selling on the coattails of racing. And what he really wanted to do was to be hugely successful and hugely wealthy. And wealth was not something that was large, I think, in Mr. Ferrari's psyche. It really wasn't. He just wanted to be the best, and he wanted to beat all the others, and he wanted to impose his will upon people. And above all, quite genuinely, he wanted to promote his area of Emilia, and he wanted to promote Modena. And I think he was very genuine in that to the end of his life. So there are similarities, but there are huge differences. And, well, earlier this year, I finished a biography on Mr. Ferrari. And I don't know, it's under design or something, or I don't know, it was a load of rubbish and they decided not to publish it. I don't know. But anyway, it's in the pipeline. But there were whole aspects of Mr. Ferrari that were completely hidden from view. And he saw his workers as his family. And if his workers were loyal to him, he was immensely loyal to them. He would still scream and shout at them like you can't believe. But some of his gestures of compassion and support were extraordinary. One day he heard through the grapevine that the daughter of one of his workers had become disabled. So in private, he hunted out that particular worker and asked him what would make life easier. And they said, well, you know, what we're really looking for is somebody to transport her around. And within days, there was a brand new hand-controlled Mini sitting in front of their house. But Mr. Ferrari made it plain that if that guy or that girl ever told anybody where it had come from, that was the end of it. It was over. Whereas Colin, I think, would have been quite pleased. Do you see what I mean?
My late uncle, who motor raced, was talking about martial arts. And he said, he is a black belt and I'm a Mickey Mouse braces. And when it comes to telling tales, you are a black belt and I'm a Mickey Mouse braces. But may I just relate to you that I learnt this summer that Fangio visited the David Brown tractor factory, and they tried to hurry him through, but apparently he had large farms in Argentina, and he would not be hurried through the factory. But would you say that Jim Clark was one of the best people as well as drivers you ever met?
Oh, yes, absolutely. The thing with Jimmy was that he never really realised he was special. And because of that, he remained essentially the very humble sort of Scottish borders sheep farmer that he was. And Trev Taylor, his teammate in 61, 62, told me once that Jimmy was really concerned for Trevor in practice for the Gold Cup race at Alton Park, because Trevor was unable to match Jimmy's times around a lap. And so Jimmy said, follow me, follow me and I'll show you what I'm doing. And so he set off, and Trev said, he set off going really quite quickly. And I was following him and following his lines and where he was braking and accelerating and so on. And he said, and then I thought, oh, well, that's a different line to the one I take, so that's good. And then, oh, he's braking a bit later than I did. I didn't think he could do it. Right, okay, yep, I'm on that. And then he said, and then the last 2 laps, Jimmy just drove away and left me for dead. And that was a very humbling experience for him. But it just shows you how good that man was.
Doug, thank you for a fantastic talk this evening. You've written lots of books. If you had to suggest to someone new to motorsport to read one of your books, which one would it be?
You've only written about 80, I think.
Yeah, that's a bit of a pointed question, isn't it? The one that I'm most fond of, that I would like to be remembered by, is Cooper Cars. Because everybody in the Cooper store, including all the villains and all the bandits, as well as all the good guys, was actually an attractive, fun personality. Every one of them. And it was just a joy from beginning to end doing that book. I loved every minute of it. Where the BRM story is concerned, a lot of the people were out of, similar calibre, similar people. But the villains, the bandits, are dreadful. And one of them, in particular, was absolutely vile, as far as I'm concerned, and shall remain so. But that's for Volume 4, which is on its way. It really is. I delivered 55,000 words of it a couple of weeks ago. So that one is happening at last. But this deadlines thing, in the monastery, they'd die with me. My record at the moment is 18 years late. But as I always say, nobody's perfect.
Okay, well, wonderful talk, Doug. Thank you very much indeed. Really appreciate it. Big round of applause for Doug Face.